All right, in today's tutorial, we're gonna be creating this animation entirely in Blender, no plugins, no add-ons, 100% native Blender tools. This tutorial is pretty long, but it's gonna be cut up in 4 sections. First, we're going to model or create all of our objects. We're then going to add shading to each one of those objects. Then we'll quickly go to each object and animate them to give them a little bit of life. And then lastly, add some lights, add some compositing to finish it out. So let's go through a few of these steps so you have an idea what you're in for here. The first big stretch is creating those rings that are going to go around our planet object. We're going to use textures to give them some character and randomly distribute some objects around them that will lock onto those curves. Then we're going to build that particle system of objects that's going to go around the planet and reflect the light. And now we're going to be in the shading section of the tutorial. Some of the rings are going to have a really simple emission material. After that, we're going to slow down and work on this really cool planet material and focus on adding detail and some interesting lighting with the cracks. Then all that's going to be left to do is add a light, add some compositing, and render it out. There's a lot of things in this tutorial, but there's so much to learn. Last week, Patreon got early access to this tutorial, along with a larger collection of tutorials where you can learn tons of stuff in geometry nodes and lighting and shading. Put a lot of effort into these tutorials to make them really good and very educational. So if you want to check that out, along with all the other tutorials that are on my Patreon, you can check that out linked in the description, and you get a discount if you subscribe annually. So with that being said, let's get into this tutorial. All right, we are going to start off with the modeling portion. So just go ahead and throw any piece of geometry into your scene just from this menu here. And I'm just going to go ahead and stick with a plane, and I'm going to call this spiral. I think that's how it's spelled. If it's not, you guys will definitely let me know. We're going to head into geometry nodes. This is what my workspace looks like. Yours might be cut in half. Either way, it'll be the same. So we're going to go ahead and click a new group, and this input right here represents this piece of geometry. We don't want it. This is just meant to hold the node tree that we're about to create. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete that input. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to get a curve spiral. So right here, just Shift A, search curve spiral, and we'll plug it right into geometry. And we have this thing. This is a really convenient way to make a spiral. So we are going to go ahead and bring our height down to 0. Bring our resolution down to, up to 200. Our start radius, it can be at 0.8. And our end radius, we're going to do at 3.2. And we're going to give ourselves 50 rotations. So this is just a really cool node. I'm not sure how to create a spiral with several other nodes, but it's nice to have it all right here. So now what we can do is get this thing to have a little bit of character by displacing it. So we need to get a set position node, which is the node we need to pretty much displace any amount of geometry or curves or anything like that. We're going to use a wave texture to displace this, but what's going to happen is when we go ahead and search up that wave texture and we plug color right into the offset, it's going to go that way. Essentially, it's combining the X, Y, and Z and displacing it that direction. What I want to do is simply displace up and down. And so what I can do is I'm just going to go ahead and take the wave texture off, and we're going to get a Shift A and search a combine X, Y, Z. And all that's going to do is expose these parameters, and I just want to displace it on the Z. So there we go. Now we have it. So if we want to see kind of how this is affecting, you can kind of see those waves there. But if I bring my scale down, you'll start to notice, all right, we have these waves. And if we play with our phase offset, it's going to do this. I, however, want it to not be this direction or this direction, but actually circular. So what we can do is here in the wave texture settings, you can go from bands to rings, and then X to spherical. And that is going to create a spherical wave. If you've ever been familiar with the wave modifier, we just made it. And then if you can play with that scale, you'll get some really cool things. So what I want to do right now is actually lessen the strength of this wave. It's far too much. The point of displacing this curve spiral is to give it a little bit of character and give us an opportunity to animate it. So what I need to do is get a vector math node, and we're going to set that to multiply. And if you've never used math nodes before, vector math and regular math, the biggest difference is vector math actually recognizes your X, Y, Z. Regular math uses what's called planar values, and it doesn't really recognize the fact that there's XYZ coordinates. So we actually want to respect those coordinates here. And so multiply specifically takes whatever you did and multiplies its strength. And so if I click and drag here, we can now actually multiply, or in this case, lessen the effect. And so if I bring up my scale now, you can see on the wave, that is, you can see it does this really cool effect. Now, when we play with the scale, you can see a very recognizable behavior here where it starts to like take on this interesting shape. So what I want to do, I'll bring it back to 0, is once I start to get this sort of chaotic looking scene where it's less wavy and more chaotic like that, then when I play with my phase offset, it's just going to do this really simple, interesting movement. So what I'm going to do is click and drag and bring this scale down a little bit so that when we are really close in and we play with this wave, this phase offset, it's just going to do this. And that's what we're looking for. Just a very simple, not super obvious movement. What I can do now is start to add some geometry to this because there's nothing we can actually render. This is just information right now. So we're going to get a curve to mesh node. And then to add the geometry, we're going to get a curve circle node. So on the radius, I'm going to do 0.003, actually 0.005 if my memory serves me right. Right there. And there we go. We now have these guys. I went and double checked. It's actually going to be 0.002. Okay, so we have this, and when we go ahead and add materials, it's just going to be this sort of plain white material. But I do want a certain amount of these rings to have an emissive, red, kind of broken up texture to it. And I couldn't find an easy way to do sort of some selections because it's really just one piece. If this was individual rings spanning out, it would be far easier to do that. I don't know how to do that. So what I'm going to do is actually make a brand new spiral. So I'm just going to highlight these guys. I'm going to hit Control J just so we can visually move it. I don't really need to label it. You can if you really like to label things. What I'm going to do is create a brand new spiral. So I'm going to go ahead and just duplicate this spiral here. We're going to get a join geometry node because we need to add him. So I'm just going to go highlight, hit G and move it over, and we'll plug that right into here. So now we have a brand new spiral. I do, however, need to get another set position node. And in this case, we're just going to go ahead and borrow the combine XYZ and the multiply. So what you can do is just highlight them, Shift D, bring them up. And then we need a little bit more space than I thought. And then move that there. And of course, to move nodes, you can highlight them and hit G to move them around. And we're going to plug the color of the wave into the vector of the multiply. And then here on the second curve spiral, we'll just give our rotations of 10. And now we can see this brand new object here. We can bring maybe sort of edit the rotation so we don't have any real intersection. We could even play with the radius until we can see those guys. But I just, they're going to intersect at some points, but we don't really want to notice it. So now that we have these brand new spirals here, we can go ahead and get their own curve to mesh node. So we'll just go ahead and duplicate that here, plug it into the profile curve, and then just give your radius at 0.0, we'll fiddle backspace here, 0.0005. And so now we have these really thin wires coming through, and it'll just add a little bit more of a dynamic look. And once we add materials, they will be very, very obvious. So that's what we're looking for, just a little bit more of an organic look. All right, so we're done with modeling these curves. I do want to play with their multiply nodes here. So I'm gonna go to the bottom one and just play with the strength. I want it to just be very, very subtle on how much displacement is being created from this wave texture right here. So what I want to do now is randomly distribute spheres all on these curves, and I want those spheres to be locked onto the curve so that when they move, they actually move with the curve. So what we want to do is just use some information from this curve spiral that we already have. So what I'm going to do is get a instance on points node, and we're going to plug it into the join geometry. And so I want to use the curve data from the big ones, which is going to be this spiral right here. So if I plug it right into here, and I plug an instance here, it will instance on every single one of these 200 points. See where it says a resolution of 200? That means this curved spiral, all 50 of its rotations, are comprised of 200 points. I don't really feel like dealing with 200 objects just yet. So before I actually realize all of these instances on here, I want to actually cut in half the amount of information. So what we're going to do is we're going to get a delete geometry node, make sure it's on points, and we're going to get a random value node, and we're going to set it to Boolean. The reason why we're setting it to Boolean is because it gives us this one single slider value. So what happens is when we plug this into here, it's going to delete half of them, 0.5 in this case, or you can see visually it's half. It's going to delete half of all of these points randomly. And so if I just go ahead and plug it into here, obviously you can't see it yet. What I'll do now is get a icosphere and I'll give it a scale of like 0.01 and we'll plug it into instance. And there we go. Now you have these random spheres everywhere. But what I'm noticing right now is that they're not actually locked on to my curves. They're below them. And that's because I plugged in the wrong set of data. I plugged in the curve right into the delete geometry, which goes into the instance on points. Actually, because we have to respect hierarchy, we need to plug in the portion that is displaced. So that would be this output. And now you can see they're on. And if we were to animate this, these spheres, or the icospheres in this case, they are locked on to our object. That's what we want. So here on the icosphere, I'm just going to bring up subdivisions of 2. We're going to get a set shade smooth node. And then I'm going to go ahead and delete more because this is way too many. So you bring that probability down and you just get a couple random ones. And that's what we want for this section. So we're totally done. What I want to do now is right here on the join geometry, each one of these chords represents a model here. So 1 object, 2 object, and then the really thin section there. So we're going to hit Shift A and get a set material node. Get one here, one here, one here. And so right up here in the materials, let's go ahead and add 2 materials. We're going to get one and just call it base. This will be the base material that the spheres and one of the spirals is going to have. And so if we can remember, right here, since it's the instance on points, this chord represents all of these icospheres, so we'll give it the base material. And then we need to look at the spiral that has the 10 rotations and the 50 rotations. So the spiral that has the 10 rotations is going to have an emissive material. So this one below it is the bigger spiral. Add it the base, and then we'll just call this one broke light. It's just short for broken light. That's going to have the emission material, and so we'll just plug broke light into this section here. And then right here on emission, we'll just give it a strength of like 10, and we'll make it red for now, just so that we can double check right up here in the material preview. There we go. We can see that it's working. So that's what I want. For the planet in the middle, it's quite literally just an icosphere that is subdivided. So we'll just go ahead and add in a subdivided icosphere and make sure that it's fitting within, but very close to the very edge of everything. And so him, we'll just call it planet in the outliner. Now we need to create all of those particles that you can see flying around the scene randomly and doing really cool things. That is going to be a geometry nodes particle system. Now, technically, we can build it within this existing node tree. I do like a less cluttered node tree. I think we're done here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and get a brand new plane. And up here in the outliner, I'm going to call it particles. And then here in the geometry nodes, we'll click new. And like we did before, we'll go ahead and delete the input. And we're going to get another icosphere. So search icosphere, plug it here. And then I want this thing to be subdivided enough to be round. Subdivision isn't going to be important here, and then bring the radius until it fills up this whole scene. What I want to do now is squish it in. So we're going to get a transform geometry node and play with the scale until it fills it up like that. So now what we can do is convert it to a volume so we can add particles in it. So we're going to get a mesh to volume node, and there we go. We now are ready to add particles within the volume of this space. So that will be a distribute points in volume, just like this. And so now you can see we can now randomly place what I'm going to call glitter throughout this scene here. So the first thing we're going to do is get a set position node. We'll get a noise texture, and this noise texture is what we're going to use to make all the animation. So we'll plug color into offset, and make sure you're using color. If you use factor, it's not going to animate them in all axes. It's going to animate them perceptually in two, but it's just combining them and making it look bad. So color is what we want to use if we're displacing or changing the position of all these objects within 3D space. We're going to click on normalize to keep it in the center, and we're going to switch it over to 4D so that we can actually animate these guys. So one thing that I always kind of do is bring the detail to 0. It gives me a much better looking movement. And I'm going to bring my scale down to 1. And now we have this right here. So now I'm ready to add my objects into this scene so we can start working on it. So we're going to get an instance on points node. And then we're going to also get a mesh circle. So mesh circle, we will plug it into instance, and these are right now not filled in. Fill type right here needs to be set to ingone, and then the vertices we're going to do 6, and then you can go ahead and bring your radius down like that. So now we have these guys, and we can play with their position here, but you can notice that they're all just sort of flat. I want to randomize their rotation. So we're going to play with the rotation here. We're going to go ahead and bring this down, and we're going to plug in a random value node. And we're going to switch it over to vector and plug value into rotation. So what we want to do is just sort of play with how these guys look rotated. So play around with your minimum and maximum values, and just sort of, again, it's completely random. And then we're going to animate one of these axes, probably this one here, for when they're going in a circle. Because the thing that's going to actually animate these guys is in the transform settings. We're going to animate it here, we're going to animate it here, and we're going to animate it here to make this fully interesting, chaotic scene. So right now, let's go ahead and bring the scale down on all of these objects. I'm going to bring the density up on my distribute points, so that when we're here, we can kind of see, all right, we're going to sort of envision the perspective. Definitely want a little bit more on these particles, and definitely want them to be a lot smaller. Now, here's the thought process behind doing this rather than just spherical objects, is as these animate in a circle and as they randomly rotate and move around, because they are flat metallic objects, they will have this very bright highlight point at very interesting moments, and it will create this really beautiful lighting effect and fill out this huge emptiness that we're going to have in this animation. So that's the whole point of this. So we are now done with this. We now have this whole really awesome looking scene where it's ready and done. So it's now ready for shading. These objects will shade first. It's going to be the literal easiest portion. So we're going to get a set material. I'm going to go here to the material preview window. And I'm going to go here to the material window, go here and just type in, or not name it, or do name it, anything you want. We'll make it metallic and a little shiny. Doing it 0 when it comes to compositing made it too bright, but if we can bring it down a little bit, maybe to like this, it felt a little better. And then I'm going to go ahead and grab the glitter, and so now you can see these objects are metallic. Very cool. Now we're going to click on the spiral right here in the outline. You can click on it. and we're going to go to the shading tab. I'm going to go ahead and close these two windows, and I'm going to hit this button here just so everything's not yellow. So let's go ahead and do two really distinctive things here. I'm going to go ahead and get a color ramp here, and notice right here where it says broken light on slot. If you don't see that, if it says base or whatever you titled it, you can go ahead and select whatever material is in here as long as those materials exist in your shader window. So I'm going to delete that. I wanted to get a color ramp here. And then we're going to make this white portion a very nice red, plug color into color. And then I'm going to go ahead and remove the scene world scene lights. I want this to be dark so I can see it better. I'm going to get a noise texture. And then if you have the node wrangler add-on enabled, it comes with Blender by default. We're just going to hit Control T, or just go ahead and search up a mapping node and a texture coordinate. I'm going to use object here, and we're going to plug factor into color. So now what's going to happen is I'm going to bring up my scale, and I'm going to bring this down. And now we have these broken up light things, just like this. And then we're going to switch over to 4D because once we get into the animation portion, we are going to animate this movement as well. And so my thought process behind having up these broken up pieces is it does sort of communicate a level of large scale-ness. And I did like the look of it. My initial design was going to have it more like that. And then we can have some fun where it kind of moves around in that way, but it ended up looking better around a scale of 73, making it look like a really big planet. And we can play with our strength once we get to the compositing portion of this tutorial, but I'm going to keep my strength at maybe like 19 or 20, just so that it's super visible. Now, there's one thing that I left off in the geometry nodes portion of this tutorial. What I want to do is randomly assign some of these spheres to be red or not red. So what we can do here is go back to geometry nodes and get the shading to recognize the individualness of the objects. And so what we can do is find right here where it says instance on points, we're going to get a store named attribute. If you've never used this before, all I want to do is to get the shading to recognize that there are individual objects here. And so what I can do is first, again, putting it on the line where the instances exist, which is right after the creation of the instances at the instance on points node, I'm just going to name it R for random, and we're going to do a wave texture. I'm using the wave simply because it's easier to animate in a loop than a noise texture. That's literally the only reason why I'm using it. Otherwise, I would use a noise texture. And so we'll plug this right into value, and instead of point, I want it to recognize instances. So now it's going to be assigning a color value to each one of these individual instances, and we can call that in the shading. And so what I'm going to do is go back to shading now. So in geometry nodes, we do need to get a new material. So I'm going to delete this material. I'm going to add a new material right here in the materials section and call it blink. And so I'll go ahead and grab the blink material and we can head back to shading. And so now what we can do is go into the emission and make sure you do have blink selected here in your slots and bring up the brightness. And we're going to get another color ramp. Plug it into color and make this red. Okay, so now we need to get an attribute node to call that attribute we just created. Its name was R, and we are messing with instances, so we need to use the instancer, and we're going to plug factor right into color ramp. And so now if I bring this in, it will randomly turn them on and off essentially. So I just want random ones. And what's cool is if we go back to geometry nodes, and I'm just going to go ahead and turn on scene world scene lights here. If I play with the phase offset of my wave texture, it's going to randomly turn on and off different spheres. And that's what we want to do once we get to the animation portion of this tutorial. So now we have random spheres turning on and off. We have this really cool light. And now we need to shade our big sphere here. So we'll go back to shading, and then I'm going to hit this drop down and turn off scene world scene lights so that I can just focus on him. So we're going to click new, and let's go ahead and get a color ramp. We need 2 color ramps. I'm going to bring this up a little bit. We're going to get 2 color ramps. One is going to be plugged into the base color. The other is going to be plugged into a bump node. So we'll plug color into height, normal into normal. What I'm going to do now is get a noise texture, and very important, plug in color to both of these guys. And here's a really cool trick. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Control T. We're going to use the object coordinate. Just bring this guy over. The best way to make really highly detailed textures very quickly is stacking two noise textures, just like that, and specifically using color. I'm going to bring the detail up to 12, and then I'm just going to bring the strength down on this bump so we see it better. See how nicely detailed that is? And then you can bring your roughness up a little bit, and you can even do it again to add even, extra levels of detail. Again, making sure you're using the color socket. It's going to take a minute to think. But now we have a very, very highly detailed material here for our planet. I'm going to go ahead and just use 2. That's all I really need. And then I'm going to bring this in to have a little bit more contrast. And then you can play with the scale of your planet, whatever you want to do. But so far we have this really nicely detailed scene. And then what I'm going to do is see how that strength looks. We're going to bring our distance to 0.1 and bring our strength very, very low, because it's supposed to be a planet, so we're not supposed to have really huge details like that. So bring it down to something like that. And even though you can barely see it now, once we have a light hitting it, it will catch those shadows really, really well. And then I'm going to bring my roughness all the way up. Now, if you want, now what I want to do is have these massive cracks going through our object. And so what we need is a brand new bump node, and bring our strength all the way up, plug it into the normal. We're going to get another color ramp, plug that into height, and we need to go ahead and get a Voronoi texture. So I'm going to get a brand new set of mapping nodes, because we are going to do a little bit of magic here on the end for some detail. So we're going to plug distance into color. We're going to go from F1 to distance to edge, and that's going to create a very unique pattern that's going to allow us to create cracks. So if we bring this color ramp in like this, we now have these cracks. Now I'm remembering I don't want to use a color ramp in this case. I want to use a map range, because we really need to tighten up the cracks, and it's really going to show the limitations of the color ramp. So we're going to use a map range instead. And then if you just bring your from max to the left, I'm going to hold down shift so it's a little bit more controlled. We're going to get that same behavior. So now we have this, and we can just bring the scale really high. I don't want a lot of cracks on my planet. I just want a few. So something like this probably works. And then these are very planar details. They're not very, they're not very detailed. So what you can do is add in a noise texture here on the vector line between these two nodes here. Plop it there. Bring your detail up to 12. You can even bring your roughness up a little bit. And now the cracks are completely gone. So here's a really fun trick if you've never seen me do this. We're going to get a mix color node. And we are going to just go ahead and take the object coordinate and bypass the noise texture and plug it into slot B. This is going to create a really nice bypass effect. So when we bring the factor over to the right, we're now just sort of incorporating the noise texture in a really cool way, just like that. So now what I want to do is bring the crack size a lot smaller. So it's what, at 0.02, we'll do 0.003. There we go. So now we have these really, really small cracks. What I want to do is now have some glowing red color coming from the cracks. So let's go ahead and build that. It's going to be a bit more of a process because we have to add detail. So we're going to go here to emission, give it a strength of 10. We're going to get a mix color node. And we're going to make one of these colors black and one of these colors a nice red. And so what we want to do now, we can go ahead and get a color ramp, which I did not need to make this red because this is going to have to be red. Like this, plug that into this, and we're going to plug map range into the color ramp. So if we bring our color ramp in, you can see it needs to be inverted. So I'm going to hit this drop down, hit flip color ramp. So now the internal portions of this are completely red. Here's the thing. Design-wise, I did not like how it looked for them all to be the same level of red. To me, it lacked the amount of detail that I would want a planet rendered to have, which is why I did this big setup. If I just wanted it to be like that, I would just simply plug a color ramp straight into the color portion of the emission, and it would just look like that. But I want to break it up a little bit. So I'm going to bring this back here, and we're going to use this factor slider to make portions of the crack have the red and portions of the crack have nothing. And the way we're going to do that is by using a texture to have a variable amount of color here. So what we can do is get another color ramp, and we're going to get a noise texture, and we're just going to borrow the mapping of this and just plug it into the vector here, plug factor here, and then plug this into the factor. So we just want a texture getting plugged into the mix. And so what happens now is if I bring this white portion in, you'll notice some of that red is no longer present in portions of the crack. And so what I want to do is just bring up the scale a little bit. Actually, no, we can bring it down. And just sort of like make it subtle, make a subtle amount of change, and so that there is just, you know, not every single part of this planet is, you know, having that red. And if you want it all to be red but have different levels of brightness, you can actually take the white portion of this color ramp and just make it a little bit darker and just meet it a little bit. So notice now how there's like a little bit and then it gets brighter here. You can do that as well. I just want a complete departure. So now we have a little bit of detail on this planet, and we are done with this portion. So now we're done shading. We are done modeling. Now we need to animate, light, and then composite. So let's head into animation. So the first thing I want to animate here is I'm just going to click on this spiral here, and then I'm going to hit the period key to bring, so blink is going to be animated in geometry nodes. I'm going to hit the slot and go to broken light. And so here we need to animate the W. So if I hit this drop down and just click scene world scene lights, we can actually look at the W. So let's go ahead and create a noise texture loop, which we're going to have to do multiple times in this tutorial. So this will be the first time. Bring your W to 0. I'm going to hit duplicate, and then we'll plug vector into vector. We're going to get a mix color node and plug factor into B. So these two need to be exactly the same, including what socket they're coming out of. If you go to your preferences in the animation tab, make sure your default interpolation is linear. So what I want to do now is just get a timeline. So I'm going to bring up a timeline if you don't already have one. Timeline here. I'm going to give myself 500 frames. That should be long enough to make this the amount of speed that I want it to be. So now I'm going to bring my factor over to the left. So here on the top noise texture, make sure you are at frame 0. I'm going to hit I on the W, I on the factor, go to the very end of my timeline, and I'm going to give it a value of 2. And then bring the factor over. So hit I on both of these once you move them. So give this a value of 2, bring this to the right, hit I. Now they're at the end of the timeline at frame 500. Here, the W of 0, add a keyframe, go to the end and hit the back arrow to frame 0. And because this one had a value of 2, this one will have a value of -2, and that is going to seamlessly loop the movement, and we can kind of see the speed. I do like it being very fast. If you want it to be slower, instead of doing a value of a 1 and -1, you can do a value of like 0.2 and -0.2, and that will make the noise really, really slow. But I like it fast. It makes it, I don't know, it gives it this really cool, interesting feeling. Now we can go into geometry nodes and create the rest of the animation loops. And so still having the spiral clicked, click on geometry nodes and look for the wave texture. If you play with the offset, you can see how we're playing with that. Let's just bring the distortion up a little bit so that it's less of, I don't know, I like the movement a little bit better that way. And so right now we're going to animate the wave texture. Now remember I said it's far easier to animate the wave texture in a loop. And if you've never animated in a loop, I'll show you. Here on the phase offset, hit I, and then just use any even number. So I'm going to do 6 times, or 6 asterisk pi, and that will create an animating loop. And we'll go to the very end and make sure it loops. Perfect. So now these spheres are going to animate, they're blinking, that is, on and off in a seamless loop, and we don't need multiple textures for it. We just play with the phase offset using pi. And now we have that done. Now what we need to do, I'm gonna hit this drop down and get some lights into the scene. We need to animate the movement of the actual curves. And so let's go ahead and find the other wave texture. Remember, we just animate it like that. And so we want it really, really slow. So let's go back to frame 0. Here on the phase offset, make sure it's 0. We're gonna hit I, go to the very end, and remember, just use an even number. The lowest even number we can use is 2, then asterisk pi, hit I. And that will create this really cool movement. And so if we hit this drop down and go back to scene world, scene lights, we can see this. The next thing that we need to animate is these particles right up here. And so if we go here to the transform settings, we can see the Z rotation. And so I want to animate that in 1 rotation. So we'll go back to frame 0. I'm going to hit I on the rotation settings, go to the very end, and I'm going to type in 360. And that's going to animate these guys in a circle, which is really, really cool, very simple. And we can go ahead and make sure you're clicking on the particles. We'll go to try to find, I'm going to hit the period key. All right, find all of our settings. This, now we need to animate this portion of their movement. And so like we did a minute ago, we're going to animate the noise texture in a loop. So I'm going to hit 0, make sure the W of the noise texture is 0. We're going to duplicate it and get a mix color node. We'll plug color into color, bring this over to the left, and go back to frame 0. To my memory, I think we need to do a value of 5. And so here in the W, I'm going to hit I, making sure we're at frame 0. Here in the mix, hit I, go to the very end, and I'm going to type in 5 on the W, bring that over, hit I, go here. And because we did a +5, we need to do a -5 here. Okay, sweet. That looks really, really nice. So now they're moving around. The next thing we need to do is animate their rotation. And we are going to kind of cheat a little bit. We're going to do what's called a boomerang animation. So go to frame 1. I'm going to hit I on these guys, go to the very end, hit I, and then right here in the middle, just kind of move them around whatever axes you want till you like the amount that you've done. And that's going to make a seamless loop. Now, the only reason why I decided to do this very hacky way of looping it, it just won't be noticeable because the objects are so small, and it just saves us a little bit of time. But now that these guys are moving around, I do think I want a little bit more rotation. There we go. Great. And so that's going to allow all these really cool moments where the metallic material gets hit by the light and it blinks and it's awesome. It will look really, really good. Here on the sphere, we need to loop that as well. So click on the sphere or the planet, go to the transform settings, and we're going to do the same thing, just a 360-degree rotation. And then here on these objects and geometry nodes, I want them a little bit smaller. I want them to almost seem like stars in terms of how they are seen in the final render. They do kind of take the place of stars in our scene in terms of aesthetics. There we go. I feel like that's appropriate, and then we can just bring up the density a little bit more to get more of them. All right, so now animation is completely finished on this guy. Everything's done being animated. Everything's looping. Now we need to light it. We need to get our camera, and we need to add a little bit of compositing. So what we'll do now is go ahead and get our camera going. So we'll get our camera, try to line it up something like this, Control-Alt-0, snap it to view, and then I'm gonna hit R. And then in this case, click on the camera settings here and do a focal length of 20. We're just getting essentially a 20 millimeter lens like this, and make sure the sphere is at the middle, just like that. Now is the first part where we can actually start to look at this in cycles. And so I'm gonna go here to the cycles view, and what I wanna do is just blur out some of these guys here. So I'm just gonna get some lighting really quick. So what we can do to get a perfect focus is using a focus object. And so what I can do here is, I know the camera is pointing this direction. I want my focus object to be right here. And so here we'll just get an empty, and you can name it if you want. And then I'm just gonna hit G and just kind of eyeball his location. But this little yellow dot is where the focus is going to be set. So I want the yellow dot to be right there. And so now, let's bring it up a little bit. I'm just using G to move it around. Perfect. And so now we can get our camera, go here to the camera setting, click on depth of field, and then select that focus object. And if you want to view the depth of field before you look at it in cycles, you can hit the drop down and click on depth of field. And you'll notice we can actually see the depth of field taking place. I'm gonna do an f-stop of 2. So if we go in the cycles preview, you can see some of these guys are a little bit blurry. Maybe we'll do an f-stop of 3. I just want like these front ones to be blurry, just to give this sense of focus and closeness, but scale. Kind of dancing around with all those options. All right, now we can go ahead, I'm gonna hit the tilde key and click front. We can go ahead and add a light to this scene. So I'm gonna hit Shift A, get an area light. Here in the area light settings, I'm gonna give it a strength of 140, and I'm gonna make it a disc. And so now what I can do is I can see, okay, the camera is looking this direction, so the light needs to hit it this way. I'm gonna hit G and move it out like this. I'm gonna hit R twice and have it point right at this. Okay, so now we have some light hitting it. Here in the world settings, we'll bring this down to black. I'm gonna hit F3 and get a render region. And then here in the volume tab, go ahead and click on principled volume and then bring your density up just a little bit so we can actually start to see the volume. So let's go back to our area light settings and give it a spread of 20. Beautiful. And let's maybe give it a slightly blue color, as I always like to do. I do want a little bit more of light here. I think it's too far toward the back. So what I can do is just take my area light and hit G and move it over. And then we'll go back to flat view and do that. Let's see how that looks. Sweet. Okay, so I really like this. This is looking good. And notice these points where the glitter is really reflecting the light, but other points of the glitter are darker because they're angled differently. That's the whole point of doing it like that. I do think there's too much negative space up here, so we can actually hit the camera. I'm gonna hit R twice and just move it like this. Okay, this is a lot better. Okay, we have a really, really beautiful scene. The last thing we need to do is add some compositing. So what I'm gonna do is hit this drop down and click always so that we can view our composite settings when we come back. And let's open up a new window. Hit the drop down here and click on compositor. I'm gonna hit the N key. So let's go ahead and go back to the cycles preview, and we're gonna click on use nodes. And the first node we want is a glare node. So now we'll plug the glare node right here, and you can start to see it showing up on parts of this animation. You can definitely see it here on these reflective points. So what I wanna do is go ahead and go from streaks to bloom and just try to see what things need to be adjusted. Right now, I like the amount of bloom on the planet. I think it's a bit too much. So we'll go ahead. So what we'll do is I'm gonna switch this window over to the shader editor, and let's just bring down the brightness of a couple things here. The planet, clicking on the planet here, right on the string that connects to the principled of the base color, you can actually take this white portion and bring it down, and it will make it a little bit less shiny. So now we have just a subtle amount of brightness rather than having a bunch. Because I do like having it, but I don't like having too much here. And then here on these guys, I think they're a little too bright. So I'm just gonna click right on one of these, or just click on the particles, where see where it says glitter. I think if you bring up that roughness, it will change how bright they are. So there we go. Maybe a roughness of 0.4 will make them not quite as bright. And then I don't want these guys right here really glowing that much. So I'm gonna click on the particles, and then where it says blink, click on blink on the slot, and then bring that strength down to like 1, maybe 2, 2.5. There we go. So now there's a little blinking, there's a little glowing because of the light hitting it, but not a whole lot. And now I'm happy with that. I'm gonna go ahead and close this window. I'm gonna go right over here to the camera icon and just turn on my motion blur, and let's do a render to see how this looks currently. Okay, so here is the current final render. I think the glitter is still a little too bright, and the sort of red lava portions of the planet are also a little too bright. So let's go back to the shading tab here. I'm gonna go here to just bring down, click on always. So here on the glitter, I'm gonna click on that right here on the particles. I'm gonna hit the period key and just bring the roughness up a little bit more. Click on the planet and bring the strength down to 5. And then on the blink materials, what I don't like is that because the light is hitting it so aggressively, it's making them glow. So I'll just go ahead and bring up the roughness on these objects. In fact, even making them a little bit darker so that they don't glow quite as much. We can even bring up the diffuse roughness on them as well. So that'll just sort of combat that extra amount of glowing that I don't want. I really only want glowing coming from the glitter. So I'm gonna do one more test render and then we'll be done. Okay, so here we are. We have a little bit of glowing here. I'm okay with it. The planet has glowing when it's hitting it, and the glitter particles have just enough glow to where they stand out and they look really cool. We are finished. So when you're ready and you're done with your scene to be finished, I highly recommend doing a PNG sequence. So my export settings right now are at 300 samples denoised. That's really all you're going to need for this. And then here, make sure you do a PNG sequence. Make sure you pick your file and then render animation. And when you're done, you'll have a really cool looking animation like mine. So there you go. This was a really long one. I rarely post really long tutorials like this. If you like them, let me know. We'll do more. But with that being said, thank you guys for watching. Again, feel free to check out the extended collection of tutorials on Patreon currently. And there you go. Hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one.